quick welcome to everyone joining us today for our webinar panel to discuss diversity, equity and inclusion on trustee boards. I'm Sarah Hillary, a partner in our Digital and Risk Advisory Services team and also a member of the firm's new board, which has responsibility for oversight of our own strategy in BDO to improve our diversity, equity and inclusion here in the firm. So I know when you registered for this session, you already thought that this was an important topic, and I'm sure we're all converts to this. But I'm so conscious there is a lot more to still do. You know, just last week and over the weekend, we heard that Yorkshire County Cricket Club has failed to comply with ECB's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, when they appointed Darren Goff as the club's managing director, which goes against the 12-point action plan they had agreed to, which EC introduced just last November. What I understand is that the chair did pledge to run an open recruitment process at the end of the season, but no other candidates have been interviewed and the job has not been advertised. And his appointment was confirmed after the board completed their performance review. But I'm sure we're all familiar with the story from earlier in the year with Yorkshire and the poor reputation that the club already has in this space. So I think I'm just mentioning this example really because it highlights that important role of the board in making senior appointments and the ability that it has to make that as open and transparent as possible or not. So that, I think, is a really good way to sort of think about this session today and what we might try and get out of it. And I'm excited to be working alongside a prestigious panel, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And I'll be coming to you first, Pippa. But Pippa, maybe you could give us a 2-minute intro into who you are and why you're here today discussing EDI with us.
Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. Good morning. Bore from Wales. So I'm going to say good morning in Welsh. My background is as a Paralympic archer, and I spent 15 years on the British team. And when I was on the team, I became the athlete representative, and I found that a route into governance.
Tony, maybe I could come to you and we can go back to Pippa.
Sure, happy to. I thought it might be my machine then. Good morning, everybody. My name's Tony Simpson. I'm a partner at a consulting firm, Oliver Wyman. Why am I here today? Look, I'm a trustee of Birmingham Museums Group, but also I'm a board advisor to Special Olympics GB, and a trustee at Drive Forward Foundation, which is a charity for care leavers, of which I'm one myself. I have done a lot of work prior to this, and one of the reasons I wanted to be on this board around getting inclusive talent onto boards, and I was responsible for setting up the FA's Diversity Inclusion Board, which is why I'll be interesting to explore issues around cricket, but also more importantly, I was responsible for bringing the first black CEO into the Professional Football Association in the UK last year. So that's me. Looking forward to talking to you all later
on. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Mark Norbury. I'm Chief Executive of Unlimited. We're the UK's leading supporter of social entrepreneurs. We back over 300 social entrepreneurs every year. And over the last few years, we've developed a particular inclusion lens to all of our work. And 50% of our awards go to entrepreneurs who are Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, and or disabled. And we've just launched a big social investment fund, a £25 million fund, which has equity and inclusion right at its heart. And my reason for being here is really I joined civil society because I wanted to try and make a difference, to channel my energy, my skills, my efforts, also my privilege towards making a fairer and better UK. And the last few years, I've learned a huge amount about equity, diversity and inclusion, and our failure as a sector to really embed it in our organisations and our governance and our leadership. And so I now think and hopefully act pretty differently about power and money, and we as an organisation do too. And I think the opportunity now is to try and be as effective an ally as I can be Obviously, as CEO, I've worked closely with the board while not being a board member, but I also do chair the New School, an educational charity in Croydon, and I'm on the advisory council of the Impact Investing Institute, and that also offers a platform to try and shift the sector's practice. Delighted to be with you all.
Thank you, Mark. And actually, I will stay with you as we move into our first question, as I think it's an area that Unlimited have certainly been working on. And the first area, and I'm hoping that we'll have Pippa back with us by the time we get to that point. But so, Tony, I'll probably follow with you at this stage. And it's really around how important do you think it is for the board to reflect the community it serves and the beneficiaries?
It's obviously vital, but it's not enough in itself, right? So it's an absolute requirement, and representation is really important. And so for Unlimited, we've had to think and act quite deeply and smartly about what does inclusion really mean, and it goes beyond representation. So for example, for the board, it's important we think about race and gender and disability, neurodivergence, but demographics and protected characteristics, again, are part of what's really vital here if we're going to learn from difference and get the best out of everyone. Another area is education and socioeconomics. Class is still a massive barrier in the UK, and we need to be conscious about that. And finally, for an organisation like ours, it was absolutely critical that we had social entrepreneurs with expertise in these social issues they're addressing on the board as well, because that's who we're accountable to. They're our key constituency, and therefore, if they don't have a significant representation, and I'm not just talking about one or two, I'm talking about around half the board, then we're not doing our job, and we're not going to have the governance, decision-making, design, resource allocation, all the different elements, strategic development, that really puts social entrepreneurs at the heart of what we do and puts social justice at the heart of what we do. And so intersectionality really matters, and thinking beyond just kind of superficial takes on representation really matters, because it's about culture and power and resources and how we use them most effectively to achieve the mission in keeping with the values of the organisation. And one way for us to put that into practice is to specify some operating principles around inclusion, impact, collaboration, learning, and organisational health. And so kind of all the big decisions we have to take and the discussions we have, we use those 5 different lenses just to kind of challenge ourselves about what we're doing and make sure that we've got enough intent around equity, diversity, and inclusion. All of our decisions around grants and awards and investment are made by majority diverse-led social entrepreneur panels, and that carries through the whole of the organisation, really. But so representation is vital, but it's a starting point, really. And I think inclusivity and challenging normative thinking, so you really get to harness the value of different perspectives and experiences as well.
Yeah, and I think that is the point around challenging normative thinking and bringing in those different voices and just celebrating the difference, really, that everyone can bring to the party, not just in terms of how they look, but in terms of their own experiences and what they've been through. Tony, is there anything that you would reflect on in that respect from your board experience?
No, I would say you sort of covered most of what I was going to say. There is something that's quite important though around all of that, and that is the question was, how important is it that boards reflect the communities they serve? It's really important that people understand that diverse boards are often uncomfortable boards, okay, because you're getting a lot of diverse thinking, and it's very easy to alight on a board that you think is doing well because people aren't falling out or people are alighting on decisions quite quickly. But having diverse thinking is actually going to make your process a lot more difficult, and it's going to rely and to mean that people on that board need to be a bit more emotionally secure enough to deliver what they want to do. And that is the key on that. There's no point having a diverse board and think you tick the box and not letting everybody think or have a say, and actually have the ability to have that lived experience and put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Whether somebody is 27 or has got a PhD of a lifetime experience as a care leaver as I've got, everybody has a valid point. And the problem is the chair of that organisation is often the key to making sure it functions properly. And if you don't have a chair that is emotionally secure, you're not going to end up where you need to be. Not the answer you wanted, but what I'm talking about is actually the effectiveness and delivery of that board is critical.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, and it's definitely something that we see in practice. The role of the chair has become a lot more. It's actually different skills from some chair skills from before, when you have a more diverse board, and how you create that environment where everyone's voice is heard, but you still come to a consensus and actually make decisions and move forward.
And the chair, the reason I mention the chair is because the chair is often sets the tone and certainly has the CEO. So the role of board members is to make sure that you've got the right person doing the job at the right time. Yeah,
absolutely. Pippa, thank you. I think we lost you for a moment there, and perhaps we could go back to a brief introduction from you, because I think we lost you in the middle of that, just so that everyone knows who you are and what you bring to this discussion.
Thanks very much, and I'm really sorry about that. My internet has completely dropped out on me, but I'm here now, so fingers crossed that I'm staying. Yes, I'm now currently the vice chair of my local health board, and I've recently joined the Charity Commission. I've been on the board of UK Anti-Doping as the vice chair there for 2 terms or so, for 6 years, and I'm a wheelchair. So I bring lived experience of disability and diversity within disability. But also, I think I like to think that I have an appreciation for the challenges that face people. So that's people generally in life. And that's really, when we talk about inclusion, that's really what we're talking about, isn't it? Is making sure that that we are including everybody in our decision making. So that's the thing, is I always say to people, I want to make the world a fairer place, and I know that life isn't fair, but it doesn't stop me trying. And so that's really why I do what I do. I think just touching on, for example, those sort of barriers that people face, and why I feel I have a broader appreciation. It's that understanding that the barriers that I face are not the same that the barriers that other people in life face. But I have a friend, and she's Muslim, so if she wants to take part in sport, she's much more comfortable in a women-only environment. She wants to have changing rooms that are suitable, and she faces challenges that are completely different from the challenges that I would face as a wheelchair user. But the fact that I face a challenge and I understand there's a barrier means I have an appreciation for her, and she has an appreciation for me. We can't live in each other's shoes, but we have to think about, well, there are things in my way and there are things in her way, and what are those parallels between that? And that's sometimes what we need to do, is have those conversations as well. So it's about that. How comfortable are you to have the conversation? And actually, even if you're not comfortable having the conversation, then sitting down and saying, do you mind if I have an uncomfortable conversation, is, I think it's one of the interesting things. And I will finish because I know we've got lots to get onto. But we still live in a world where 65% of people are uncomfortable talking about disability. So that is, more than half the world are uncomfortable talking about it as a subject. And until we start talking about disability or equality, equity, diversity, inclusion, all of these big topics, we are not going to progress much further. So it's really good to be here today because of that.
Thanks, Pippa. And do you have any reflections on how important it is for the board to reflect the community that it serves as well, based on maybe even your experience at UK or AD or any of the other bodies that you're on?
Yeah, I mean, it's vitally important, isn't it? And, for example, in the local health board, thinking about things from the perspective of, how does the patient feel? How would I feel if it was my granny waiting for her hip? Those sorts of things, I think, are really important. But being reflective, of course, there are a couple of things, aren't there? Number one is you can be visibly reflective of your local community. And then that's important, I think, in terms of other people feeling that they also could get involved. Because there's an expression, isn't there? If you can see it, you can be it. And so I think that there's something in that visible diversity, but we should never forget that diversity isn't always visible. So if you talk about neurodiversity, for example, it's not visible. People can see I'm a wheelchair user, but you can't tell I'm a wheelchair user right now at the other side of the computer screen. You wouldn't know unless I told you. So there's something, isn't there, about we need to make sure that diversity of our boards genuinely reflects our community. And that doesn't just mean populating it with people who don't look the same as us. And, and whether they don't look the same as us because of the colour of their skin or because they use a wheelchair, whatever it happens to be, we need to be considerate of all of our population and reflecting them. And then there's something about telling those stories. And that's an important thing as well, I think.
Yeah, sharing stories. Definitely there's been a lot more around that in the last few years about the importance of being able to share experiences and talk about them and the benefits that brings to others. Okay, actually, Pippa, I'd quite like to stay with you for the next question, actually, in the beginning, because I know it's an area that you are quite passionate about as well, which is to do with one of the barriers that, you were reflecting on barriers, and one of the barriers that is often cited as playing a big part is around recruitment. And I'd like to just ask you this, how do you have any examples of where you've seen that work well, where those barriers have been taken down, or even where that recruitment process could have hindered diversity?
Well, I can give you a couple of examples. I was relatively recently invited to an interview, which was in London, and there was very little consideration of the cost of getting to London from South Wales. So if we are now talking about diversity of people from, who don't have as much cash or who've been unemployed for a while, how on earth are they supposed to find interview expenses to get to London, for example? So that's a very simple example. And it was something that, it's a barrier that could easily be removed, that the organisation could have said anybody who's travelling from more than, I don't know, let's arbitrarily say 50 miles away will be entitled to interview expenses. So it's about thinking about how do we remove those barriers in advance. And then I can give you a really good example of where I found that happen. When I went for my interview at UK Anti-Doping, I was contacted beforehand to say, congratulations, going to interview. When would you like to come? And the person I spoke to said to me, now, I understand you're a wheelchair user. Is there anything that you need in the office? We've got wide doorways and we've got an accessible toilet. And if you want to come up the night before for an early interview, the closest hotel is only about 200 yards away, but it is down a very steep slope. So if, for example, you did want to stay and you needed a hand because the slope is so steep, you could give me a call in the morning and I could come down and give you a hand. So there was a real appreciation of what the barriers might be to me attending. And then the solution was presented in advance for me. And that I feel is really important, because actually very often when we're talking about diversity, we live in a society where the people who are the smaller groups within society are consistently having to ask for something, ask for things to be got off a high shelf, ask for a prayer room, ask for a ramp for the train. And it can get, it's not particularly pleasant having to consistently ask. So I always feel that one of the things that we can do when it comes to recruitment is we can start thinking about what are the barriers that people face. And then we can think about how do we remove those barriers before people ask for it, so that we are offering a solution to make it happen rather than expecting the person to ask for something constantly. So, and I think I'll carry on the same topic of recruitment, because as you mentioned, I'm very passionate, but I will only make one final point, and it's about job adverts and application forms that actually say, please fill in this application form, and right at the end of the form it says, and we welcome applications from underrepresented groups, minority groups, whatever it happens to be. And really what we should be doing is, our headline should be, we're a great organisation, we're really inclusive, we want to work with people, we value life experience, and if you need any support to be able to fill in this form, attend our interview, here's our email address. And we should put that front and centre, instead of making people feel like they're an afterthought. Because if you make them feel like they're an afterthought, they start thinking that they're there just for a box ticking exercise. And that's not what any of us want. And now I will stop.
Thank you, Pippa. That's a good one. I think there was also a point around job adverts in terms of qualifications that people might need, and not, for example, forgetting about all the many years of experience somebody might have, but still saying, oh, you need to have a degree for a particular senior role, which may actually not be really relevant anymore.
Yeah, if you leave school at 16 because you need to care for somebody, and you go and work in Sainsbury's at the checkout, and then you work your way up to be managing director of your local Sainsbury's, how is whether or not you...
We're losing Pippa again. Have a degree is relevant, I think is what she was going to say. So I'll use that opportunity to move on to Tony. Is there anything you would like to add on this one?
Well, as somebody who left school at 15 with 2 O-levels and is now a partner at...
do anything about how, for example...
Sorry, shall I talk?
Yes, sorry.
Sorry. No, look, as somebody who left school at 15 and is now a partner at one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the UK, it is really important. I think, look, I spent, before I did this job, I've been in leadership and consulting for a long time. And I can give you some real examples. Your question, just going back to what we were talking about, was around inclusivity, around recruitment.
Yeah.
Everything that Pippa said, it rings true, but the critical area actually is 5 years ago, I was approached by the National Bank of Jamaica, who were looking to recruit a CEO for the UK, and they could not find a single recruitment firm who had somebody senior who looked like me. Why is that important? Because when you go for an interview, let me give you another example. If you were going in for an interview as a CEO in 1975, and every single person interviewing you was a white middle-aged male, you were a female, you'd start to use the first 15, 20 minutes of that interview to talk about how subconsciously, I'm not going to be having a child the next 5 years, by the way, because you know that's what they're thinking of, how you are dedicated, and you'd probably have to become more male than the men. Now let's roll that place to somebody of colour. The reason it was important was every single person I interviewed, when they walked in and saw me showing the interview panel, said, oh my God, this is real, totally. And they didn't have to waste that 20 minutes saying, yes, I cycle, I play golf, I live in the home counties. These are all code words, by the way, for saying, I can do the job to everybody else on this panel. And what happens is they lose 20 minutes of an hour interview and I've done it myself. One becomes accustomed to doing that, and that is at a disadvantage. And what's happening is you are not getting the best of those people because they're too busy trying to respond to your view of what you think they are. Not you, obviously, not this call, but a society's view of what they think they are. So that is critical. And I've recruited genuinely 15, 20 senior execs, whether of different abilities, whether of different races or females, but actually it's about leveling the field. And the point you said earlier, you can't be what you can't see, is really critical. And unfortunately, it's a burden a lot of people have to carry, but in an interview process, it's really critical.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. Mark, any final comments on that briefly before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, for our board recruitment, we've been fortunate that we have a community of 15,000 social entrepreneurs, many of whom have lived expertise that we can go to. And I think the combination of lived and learned expertise and how you weave that together seamlessly, or relatively seamlessly, it's never going to be seamless, is really important. Everything that was said about accessibility and the user friendliness of process and just being really thoughtful in advance and not making things an aftershock resonates strongly. For us, that means there's a thing we're kind of interviewing, or the recruitment process is seen as tests, and it's really unhealthy, and it really puts people off, particularly people, because the power dynamics in that kind of setup are really poor. And what you want is you want to see someone's potential, right, to contribute and what they can offer, and bring in as much of themselves to the board or to an executive role or whatever it is. And so you have to create psychological safety for that. And so kind of the warmth and understanding, the productivity and the user friendliness of the whole comms and process and the people throughout has to really be carefully thought through. And interviewing shouldn't be about testing or putting someone in challenging scenarios. It's much more about engagement and enabling them to have a really rich dialogue and bring all the potential they have to bear in that discussion. And I mean, I think that just reinforces what Tony was saying. You want to remove the noise and the barrier and the disruption that create that feeling of it's not my place, it's not for me. And so I just think that how you really engender psychological safety is really, really vital.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are all really helpful reflections on this, actually, and possibly things that people don't think enough about when they're actually going out to do their board recruitment. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us on. And Tony, I'm going to come to you first with this one, but it's so I think we've touched on it to some extent already, but it's all well and good having that diverse board, but how do you ensure that those on the board are empowered to contribute effectively?
I think we've covered, the first thing is that the chair is critical to making sure that everybody has a fair voice. I think the other thing is actually, and Pippa sort of touched on it earlier, if you were in Carlisle and you were looking for a board that was diverse and representative, and there weren't just the volume of people around who might give a reflective board in the UK, you would be. I've heard people say, "Well, we just can't get the right people on the board." So actually, the times you have the board meetings might need to change in order to get people who can't usually be on that board. So rather than doing a board between 9 till 5 because it suits the majority of the senior people on the board, if you've got somebody who's part-time or a mother or somebody who's working 3 or 4 jobs but is reflecting a part of society you don't do, we have technology. We're doing this on Zoom now. Why not have a board meeting at 7 p.m. of every 3 months, which is going to allow somebody with a different voice who doesn't have access to get to you and might be in a different part of the country. So that's just a way that you can do that. I remember the question, by the way. I think you were saying, how do you get diverse?
How they can contribute effectively when you have a diverse board.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And the other thing is, if people are deaf, making sure that they have access to that board through signing. And a really simple thing is, there's technology now, as we're talking now, we could be having our words coming up at the bottom of the screen. So people who are deaf could be involved in this. And it's something that we've done in the past. And you've opened up another slurry of people who could get onto the program as well. There are lots of different elements to this when it goes back to that lived experience of putting yourself in different languages and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a case of who you are as a charity, what you're trying to achieve, but more importantly, being centered around your trustees, and also for many people, deciding how you interface with your service users. as well, because having service users, giving them access to your board or what you're doing is also quite important, because it gives a bit of transparency and holds us all to account, which can be uncomfortable.
Okay. Thanks, Tony.
No problem.
Mark, anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've got better at over the last 4 or 5 years is simplifying and focusing board papers, so that, there was a lot of administrative and governance heaviness that we've tried to take out. Obviously, you need to keep the rigor of the governance, and at the same time, if you're going to have a really meaningful discussion, you need to make sure that the key points come out so that all the different perspectives from all the different members of the board can be heard and kind of fully appreciated. And so how our chairs of our different subcommittees present what was discussed at each of the committees to the full board for a couple of minutes and focus on really bringing out the 2 or 3 key things, rather than it being buried somewhere in 70 pages of paper, has been a shift that has actually made for a much more participatory and engaged discussion at board for everyone across all topics. And so that's something that for us was important. I think also the prep and the follow-up become even more important if you're genuinely being inclusive and you're going to get the best contribution from everyone. And so you need to challenge yourself. It doesn't have to be hours and hours of prep. It's just the quality of the prep, and that it's done far enough in advance so that you can run it through, so that you can make sure that anyone who you need to bridge with is going to find that a really good experience. In a similar way to kind of Pippa described, the hill with the incline and the outreach that was prior to that, making sure that when the board comes together, an awful lot of the work has already been done, so that time together can really be focused on trust and getting the best out of everyone, and the interpersonal dynamics that make a group of different humans coming together really effective.
Thank you. There's some really interesting points that I'm going to take away to my own charity board as well, just in terms of how we do some of this feedback. Pippa, is there anything you'd like to add on that question?
I just think there's something, isn't there, around making sure that people's voices are valued for the skills that they bring to the table, and not just for bringing their life experience. Because I think you'll find that anybody who has any kind of diverse background who sits on a board often feels that they are there to represent, the whole of the disabled community. For example, Tony mentioned, a deafness, for example, and I'm not deaf, and so therefore, even though I know it's a barrier, I can't tell you what the lived experience is. So for all eyes to turn to me on all matters disability, I think is a challenge. And that's something that we need to make sure then that even if we do turn to the one person in the room who is either black or disabled or whatever it happens to be, that then we only use that as a springboard for a whole board conversation, and that we are also, I come to the board for my governance experience as well as my lived experience. I'm not just there because I happen to use a wheelchair. And that's the thing, is to understand that we make best use of all of the skills that the people around the board table bring. And that if we do have that thing where all eyes suddenly turn in one direction, that we understand that that's only a starting point for a whole board discussion. And it's not down to the individual to provide all of the answers.
Yeah, that's a really interesting area to bring up, actually, Pippa, and we see it even with finance skills. So sometimes I think, especially if we're moving to boards where you've got that lived experience element, and we saw it with some of the sports governing body reviews that I did before, where you'd have someone on the board who was perhaps an accountant or bringing finance skills, but also had a real interest in the sport, had that emotional connection to the sport. And actually, their emotional connection took over from their skills. So it's really important as well that that whole board discussion and thinking, you know, it's not like relegated, oh, you're the accountant or you're the disabled person or so that whole board element, I think, is very vital. I agree. Right. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us on. Final question for our panel, and it's action focused. So it's really just, and I think you've actually given us some good examples already of things that people can quite easily do, but perhaps if we can draw it together and just if each of you could give one key action or practical suggestion that has had the biggest impact on your organisation or a board that you're on, or even a suggestion that you think would be quite easy to implement straight away. And Tony, I'll come to you first on that one. That's okay.
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't, but there you go.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm joking. So the question is one thing that you think's made one thing that would make an impact around inclusion and equity on the board.
From an action point of view.
From an action.
Someone on the call could take away and think, I could implement that in my board.
Yeah. I think that one of the key things is around timings of board meetings and how we have them. Doing them both virtual and in place. Because it's been a barrier to the cadence of board meetings, and the cadence of board meetings is really important, especially when we're going through challenging times, which we all have done post-COVID. It's very easy to, take a straw poll out and only 5 people can make it, and then the chair will decide, oh, let's just do it anyway. There's 3 of us, and send a paper around. Actually, it's easier if it's easier to keep the cadence up by having everybody access it either after 7 p.m. if need be, or in the morning, because that just allows for better decision making and more frequent decision making. So for me, that is a key one. We've covered all the equity and inclusion stuff earlier. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and Pippa, what would you say?
So for me, I think I put quite a lot of thought into this beforehand because there are so many practical suggestions you can come up with. But I think what underpins all of it is something that's enshrined in the NOLA principles around openness and transparency. And I think it's about acknowledging some of our conversations may feel awkward. Sometimes we don't want to talk about things because of the way it makes us feel, but we should acknowledge that and we should start having those open conversations. And it's okay to preface it by saying, I feel really uncomfortable about this. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology, and I'm not sure whether I should be being politically correct or not. And it's a good way to start a conversation, because it's about having those conversations without judgment or prejudice. And I think that's a really good starting point, that for all of those boards who aren't very diverse and want to increase their diversity, who want to include more people, it's about them, first of all, sitting down and saying, how do we feel about this? And can we have a conversation that gives us a more open outlook to what we might look to achieving in the future? So I would say have the uncomfortable conversations.
Thank you, Pippa. Very valuable. Mark?
Similarly, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of little practical things. So I didn't feel any one of those was going to be all-encompassing enough. So I think, as well as challenging oneself, also having understanding, so stepping into other people's shoes or trying to see the world through their eyes and lives is the most kind of all-encompassing tip. My sense is that the thing that really unlocked kind of the most significant shift for us, and it's not a quick, easy, practical tip, was doing our equity audit. And we got, it was led by a fantastic HR advisor with loads of lived expertise who really challenged us, but in an environment that created really effective trust, and it shifted us miles, that whole process. So it's not one easy small thing, but it is one thing. And if I think organizations and boards are really ambitious about this, having someone who's a trusted expert, who's independent and is happy to challenge you, is pretty critical, because it enables you to move much faster and deeper.
Yes, and I can definitely see the benefit of that equity audit, actually, in terms of just having that external perspective and then pushing some. In a sense, you put barriers in your own way, don't you? Because you think, well, can we do that? How could we do that, etc. And they just help you see through some of those things and help you move forward more quickly. Okay, I would like us to do just a few minutes of questions from the audience. If I can just have a quick look at those.
Can I just answer some of the two kind of ones at the end about an equity audit, just because I generated those questions.
Yes, sure.
So it's essentially rather than a financial audit, it's an audit of your equity, diversity and inclusion practice, thinking, mindset, culture, and so forth. And it's typically an HR leader who comes in, has real expertise in the field of EDI, and who spends a few months kind of interviewing with surveys, with evidence and data points to kind of tell you where you're at in terms of your own EDI progress and learning. And then we created an action plan off the back of that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. I think there was quite a nice question actually for you, Pippa, which is, we lost her again. But I think we can all have a think about it. But it's this one where Pippa gave the example of the hotel, and if there was a risk that we could cause offence if we assume the solution. So, by putting that on someone from our own perspective rather than asking them what they need. Pippa, what do you think? Did you hear that question?
I'm afraid my internet dropped out again. Okay. So could you repeat the
question? It literally says, I'm often wary about assuming what the solution might be. So in your example of the hotel, where you were giving, how would you make interviews accessible, etc., is there a risk that you could cause offence if we assume the solution and put that on someone from our own perspective rather than asking the individual what they need? I think we might have lost Pippa there, actually.
While we've lost her, why don't I answer the question on how do we attract diverse boards? Because I think that's quite an important one, and it's come up quite a few times. There is I'll tell you what we don't do. We don't use LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is used predominantly by people with a certain thought set and social strata. You probably don't go to most of the recruitment agencies out there, because people who use recruitment agencies have the habits of professionals and middle-class people. So I can only use the experience I've used before, and that is that if you want people who think differently, act differently, and will give you a different perspective, you need to work harder in finding them. And by working harder in finding them, it might be, and it sounds odd, but if you want middle-class Nigerians, you go to church and you find them there. If you want to go and look for people from different communities around different foods, you go to those places there. I.e., there is no one easy way to do it, but you will find that you will get people who are motivated to want to work with you in different places. And the charity sector and sober sector is represented by underrepresented minorities. So, I'm a board director of Special Olympics Great Britain, which is a charity I'm board director, advisor, sorry, for Special Olympics Great Britain, which is a charity for people with intellectual disabilities. People from ethnic minorities are underrepresented within that group. So you've got the whole intersectionality there. So how and where do you find people who have not only the disability to deal with, but also a different cultural context of that disability? And so you need to start looking quite hard and quite quite robustly to find those answers, and they can be found and they will be found, but it's not using the same routes that you might have done beforehand. So I haven't given you an answer. What I've tried to do is give you the barriers to answers, so that depending on what your charity is, what your need is, you can start looking in different places.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable perspective, actually, in terms of that. One of the things I think, Tony, that you've also referenced during the conversation, or it's come up quite a bit during the conversation, is really how the role of the chair in board meetings that are more diverse and how we upskill chairs. Is there anything that you've seen where chairs have been, chairs get that extra support really to help them with those skills? Or do you think it's an area that we still need to do more work on?
I think the role of the chair is really not dangerous. It's really dangerous for charities and organisations. Traditionally, a chair was somebody who was a great figure in the city, or somebody in the sports industry who's been an icon for a sport, etc. And they've come in. They are not always the best people to chair those organisations. They have often a preconceived view of what that charity organisation's delivery is. And as the world changes really quickly, and 50% of the world's population are under 25, and how we communicate with people and fundraise is very different. You need somebody who understands that, and somebody who is, as we talked about beforehand, emotionally secure enough to be able to say, do you know what, I might be wrong here, I might not have the right answers. So hiring a chair for the board is really critical. And I would tend to do it in 3-year blocks, because things change so quickly. And so therefore you're looking for a chair who, and don't be afraid to rewrite your brief for what the chair's role is, what success looks like for that organisation. Because any organisation, especially charities, one of the charities I'm involved with, has gone through a huge growth period in the past post-COVID, because service users have been so dominant there. We've got lots of money in terms of, which is a nice problem to have, I have to say, from fundraising. So the role now has gone from raising funds to actually distributing, actioning, and delivering our key message, which is a different skill set that we had on the board. And so disproportionately, we need somebody to have the voice to help us deliver, to make the impact that the charity needs to have. And so the role of the chair has to be somebody who says, you know what, this is great, but now we need to look at a CEO or chief operating officer who will allow us to spend money, by the way, because people don't like to do that in charities. We all like a slush fund, we've got one. But be brave enough to deliver and put ourselves into an uncomfortable position again.
Yeah, lovely. Actually, just a final question, Mark, I'll ask you to just give a few words on this. It's the point we were discussing about truly diverse boards being uncomfortable, and then how we create that emotional safety for everyone to speak up and feel that their voice is heard.
Yeah, I think the chair's role as a listener and being humble and being able to read the room and being able to bring people in, voices, all different voices.
Yeah.
Celebrating both, as Pippa was saying, both the kind of lived and learned experience and skills people bring, and knowing when to weave those together. That's a lot about kind of the psychological safety. And so making sure that, also challenging when things are getting a bit normative or a bit safe or a bit kind of how things have always been. I think that's important so that others can feel comfortable providing challenge. And, you know our chair, Sarah, he's a strategy consultant. He's brilliantly analytic and great at solving problems. But if there are challenging conversations at board level, actually the last thing you want is to try and rush to a quick and probably insufficient solution. What you want is to be able to hold that space, uncomfortable as it might be, so that you can really get to the heart of the issues and kind of sit with uncomfortable silences and kind of make sure that isn't glossed over or rushed through in any way. And fortunately, our chair can also do that. So I just think it's, as you were saying before, it was about kind of great and the good and or whatever that means, and so there was a lot of ego attached to it, and frankly, it's the opposite of what's needed. It's fundamentally a role that's about enabling the whole and enabling each of the other people and voices. And so I think in terms of psychological safety, for sure, the chair's role is the most important role in generating that.
Thank you. Right, conscious of time, and I'd like to thank everyone on the panel, Tony, Mark and Pippa, for joining us today for that panel. Before we close, we just wanted to show you a snippet of our DEI maturity matrix that we've been developing. It's a free tool, and Dan is here with us just to explain it a little bit more. Dan.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So just to respond to one of the questions on the chat, actually, there was a question about the difference between equity and equality. And just really quickly, there's loads of stuff out on the internet you can research on that subject. But equality allocates the same resources to everybody, irrespective of their situation, whereas equity is about allocating resources that are tailored to the needs of the individual. So I think at a really, really high level, that sort of summarises it, but you probably want to look into it in a bit more detail. In terms of our tool, so this isn't an equity audit, as Mark referenced earlier, but it's a starting point. It's a high level assessment. And what it is essentially there are a number of tools that you can go to out there if you're looking at, for example, ESG. So there are a number of standards that exist. Not so much in terms of DEI. So there wasn't very much out there that an organisation could go to and say, well, okay, you know, how do we think we're doing? What does good look like? So this tool has been developed, or is in development actually, in conjunction with an organisation called Inside Edge, and that is a 5-pillar model. So it looks at the likes of leadership and recruitment, which we've discussed a lot here, culture, and investment and measures. So how much investment an organisation is doing, and it will provide a high-level assessment. So essentially, what it does is it will ask you 20 questions. It will ask you initially where you want to be in terms of compliance, and it uses a 5-tier assessment framework for that, from unaware to disruptive. And what it will also do is it will ask you a few questions up front, which I haven't included here. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to build benchmarking data. So we'll ask about the size of your organisation and the structure of it, etc. So that over time we can build that data set, and then we can provide you back with some benchmarked information. So it's a very quick tool. It takes 5 minutes to complete. There are 20 questions, and there's an example up here, but they are being further enhanced. So there are a number of statements under each of the 20 questions, and all you need to do is click on the answer that best aligns to your organisation. And there's a couple more here. So you can see this is built on a proprietary software that we've developed in-house at BDO to do this. So 20 questions, number of statements, 5 minutes of your time, and probably best completed by if you have a DEI lead or a governance professional in the organisation, probably somewhere at that level. And what it will do is automatically provide you via email with a report template. And what that report template does is it gives you an overall index, which is based on an algorithm which takes your scores and calculates them overall for the 5 pillars. So you'll get an overall score, and that will tell you where you are in terms of your DEI efforts. And then further, what it will do is for each of the pillars, it will map your score, and it will also map it against your desired end state, which is specific to each of the 5 points in the pillar as well. So it's not one score for all 5 pillars. And what it will then do is just provide you with some really high-level next steps that you can take to help further embed DEI in your organisation. So, for example, on this slide here, developing a plan to regularly communicate the values of DEI to your organisation, or ensure that your mission statement and strategic priorities convey DEI as a top priority. And as I say, just another example here. So it will do that for each of the 5 pillars within the tool. And you can take that forward to have discussions internally with your organisation, come and speak to a professional about next steps in terms of what support you might need, which might indeed be an equity audit. So that essentially is the tool. It will be available, we hope, this side of Christmas, and we will launch it and make it available. But what you'll be able to do is reach out to your BDO contact, or to Sarah or myself, and we'll be able to share that with you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Dan. And yeah, we'll launch that to everyone, so that if you want to take advantage of that in your organisation and just get a sense of where things stand at the moment, hopefully that will be of some value to you. Just to close, very conscious of time, once again, I'd like to thank Mark Norbury, Tony Simpson and Pippa Britton for joining us today and for sharing your words of wisdom. Thank you very much. And I guess really just sum up with the 3 things that were mentioned as potential actions. So one was around timing of board meetings to enable them to be as accessible as possible. So thinking about time, whether they're virtual as well as face-to-face. Secondly, around openness and transparency, being comfortable to have the uncomfortable conversations. And also finally, just challenging oneself, and having the understanding to try and see things from others' perspective, and really just trying to put yourself in other people's shoes from that point of view. So I think really just to finally close, in the words of Stephen Covey, let's recognise that strength lies in differences, not in similarities. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and the recording will be available after the session as well. Thank you and goodbye.